Purse.
Let us pray. Guide us, Lord, in all our doings with your gracious favor. Afford us your continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in you, we may glorify your holy name, and finally by your mercy attain everlasting life, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we beseech thee, upon thy servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that they may in all things walk before thee with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in their several offices, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Most gracious God, author of all good things, we humbly beseech thee for the Parliament of Barbados, especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou wouldest be pleased to direct and prosper all their counsels to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, and the safety, honor, and welfare of our people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen. Together the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency, the President. Announcements by Your Honor, President.
Under announcements, since we last met, we had the sad news of the passing of a former member of this chamber, Senator Professor Frank Allen. I ask you to join me in a moment of remembrance. May he rest in peace. Thank you. I received for confirmation minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, March 5th, 2023. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the confirmation of the aforementioned minutes.
The question is that the minutes stand confirmed. All of the senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Minutes stand confirmed. Sorry. Oh. Yes. My apologies, I have the wrong note in front of me. Let us cancel that confirmation. The minutes for confirmation are actually minutes of our meeting on February 15th, 2023. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the confirmation of the minutes of the meeting held on Wednesday, February 15th, 2023.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting of Wednesday, February 15th, 2023 stand confirmed. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Those minutes definitely stand confirmed. Thank you very much. My apologies. Under further announcements, I have indications of late arrival from Senator Monique Tate, Senator Kevin Boyce, just those two. No further announcements.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers, reports from select committees, questions to ministers, request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate moved by minister.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of the sitting. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. That Standing Order stands suspended for the remainder of the sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the following items. Passing of a resolution for
Bills.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the Appropriation Bill 2023. Notice of this was given on the 17th of March, 2023.
The question is that the Appropriations Bill 2023 be read a first time. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 4, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Appropriation Bill 2023.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I rise on this occasion to introduce the measures which are covered under the respective heads for the government's appropriation bill for the financial year 2022 to 2023. Mr. President, I am going to speak today about the government's program over the last financial year. I am, of course, going to speak about the macroeconomic framing of the government's program for the last few financial years, specifically the last 3 years or so, 4 years almost, and then the period obviously since 2018. And those then will be the framing, the contextual framing, Mr. President, for what the government is proposing to do in these estimates of expenditure contained in the appropriation bill, and thereafter the projections for government expenditure for the next 3 years, Mr. President, as represented in our projections. Mr. President, I do not have to say to anyone in this room, neither do I have to say to anyone in the public, that the last few years, from 2018 till now, have been difficult years. I don't have to say that to anyone, Mr. President. I don't think that I have to say to anyone that we have had any number of financial difficulties that have resulted in us having to make adjustments to our expenditure, which would then result in changes in how government approaches its public policy planning. But Mr. President, as I was preparing for today's debate, I took the time, Mr. President, to go all the way back to 1991 when we were last in an IMF program. I took the time, Mr. President, to look back at speeches from 1991 and budgetary presentations and estimates of expenditure from the period 1991 to today's date. I took the time, Mr. President, to look at what governments across both sides of the political aisle have done as they adjust to the external factors that have affected our country, Mr. President. 1991, we had what was then termed as the greatest financial crisis that we were navigating. When this administration, the Barbados Labour Party, lost the government in 2008, we then heard the government on the other side at the time speaking about the recessionary climate that they found themselves navigating. Mr. President, before that, in 2001, we navigated the exigencies created by September 11th and the threat of international terrorism. Mr. President, in the post-1994 period, we navigated Barbados's and the developing world's accession to the World Trade Organization and what liberalization of commitments meant for economies. And in particular, we navigated what they meant for small, open economies like Barbados that are vulnerable to external shocks. When we came to office, or as the honourable member, an honourable member from the other place often describes it, when we first came to service in 2018, Mr. President, I also look back at the commentary about where Barbados stood at that time. We knew, and I don't need to say to anyone here, whether or not you sit on this side of the partisan divide or on the other side, or you are an independent and you just, all of us are Barbadians, and so we navigate Barbados identically, irrespective of which side of the political divide we sit on. And so it is not up for question, Mr. President, that in 2018, when this administration came to office, that we were navigating, again, one of the most significant challenges that we have faced in terms of recessionary climate. I am going to talk in my presentation today about what that looked like in 2018, but I'm going to draw parallels between what previous estimates of expenditure and previous macroeconomic policy frameworks looked like all the way back from 1991. As I looked at the late Right Honourable Professor Owen Arthur, for example, and I took the time to go through a lot of his speeches in Parliament over the years. Each time, he chronicled the difficulties that the country was facing, why those difficulties were being navigated, what was required of countries around the globe, and what Barbados specifically, which was our responsibility, was going to do to adjust to those crises. He talked about what Barbados was doing domestically, what our national policy-making frameworks needed to look like, and how we needed to be able to pivot. He called it counter mitigation strategies in many of his presentations, Mr. President, because we accept, above all else, as researchers, as social scientists, that small, open economies like Barbados are always required to implement counter mitigation strategies to deal with exogenous or external shocks. And I have just listed a few of them: 1994, 1991, 2001, 2018, and we are now living through, in terms of parliamentarian decision-making, the 2018 counter-mitigation measures as outlined in these current estimates of expenditure. In his farewell to Parliament in 2018, Mr. President, I was intrigued at how his words were almost prophetic in 2018. These are the words that the late Right Honourable Professor Owen Arthur said in his introductory remarks on his farewell. He said, "The next Parliament will have to preside over the greatest challenges that have ever been faced in this country. The greatest ever. They will have to make the greatest adjustments ever. They will have to do it with a certainty of confidence that this generation of parliamentarians are no less equal to national development and the challenges of development than any other previous generation of parliamentarians. This was what the late Right Honourable Owen S. Arthur said in his 2018 farewell speech to Parliament. Those were his opening words. We came to office to navigate what we understood then to be the greatest challenge to national development that this country had ever faced. We understood those challenges in 2018, Mr. President, to be specific to our fiscal crisis. We understood, Mr. President, that in 2018, at the end of March 2018, the total external debt stood at $3.167 billion. Total domestic debt stood around, Mr. President, $11.86 billion. Total public sector debt, as at 2018, as we understood those greatest challenges to be, stood at US $9.09 billion. We understood, Mr. President, that our debt to GDP at that time in 2018, Mr. President, was 178.764% of annual GDP at 2018. That was what the late Right Honourable Owen S. Arthur understood to be the greatest challenge that we needed to be equal to in terms of national development. We knew as an administration, even in opposition, that we had high public debt. We knew that we had expensive public debt, and I will come to that as I go along because there is debt and there is debt. We knew that there was high public debt. We knew that at the time, 68 cents of every dollar earned in this country, whether by taxes or by growth and investment, was going to service expensive debt. That was what we knew in 2018, Mr. President. And that was what the Right Honourable Owen Arthur was speaking about in terms of the scale of the adjustment. Now, what did this administration do facing those greatest challenges as we understood them at 2018? Mr. President, this administration, we all know, we lived through it. We made some difficult decisions. We approached those difficult decisions, Mr. President, with what he described was needed, a certainty of confidence that we were equal to the task. They were not always popular or easy decisions, Mr. President, but we had to approach them with a certainty of confidence that it was what was necessary. And so on that basis, Mr. President, immediately after we came to office, we made the decision that we would have a selective default. We chose to default on our debt, and we entered immediately thereafter, Mr. President, a debt restructuring, starting first with our external debt, and then we navigated the domestic debt restructuring. There were painful decisions, Mr. President. But the context for that, Mr. President, also would have been that we were navigating multiple downgrades by the international sovereign ratings agencies on the status of Barbados' fiscal affairs. We knew that whether it was Standard & Poor, Moody's, or any of the others, it was not the Barbados Labour Party saying that Barbados was in a fiscal crisis. It was not the former Prime Minister who led the Barbados Labour Party, and who I am quoting this morning, who said Barbados had a fiscal crisis. It was not the Barbados-based entities alone who were saying that we had to close the fiscal gap because our debt was unsustainable. It was not just us alone that was saying that our debt was expensive debt. So whether, again, you sit on either side of the partisan divide and your emotions want to push you in one direction or the other, the independent analysis of Barbados' fiscal position at 2018 was that Barbados' debt was unsustainable, Barbados' debt was too expensive, and Barbados was in trouble. And we saw Barbados go to its lowest state ever in its history, with the ranking of our sovereign debt by all of the ratings agencies. And so, yes, some of the decisions that we had to make back in 2018 in preparation for dealing with these greatest challenges to face our nation were difficult ones. But the scale of the adjustment had to include everyone. It could not have been, Mr. President, that a government coming to office and dealing with the kind of challenges that were being described locally and globally could make decisions that were only affecting some, but not all. So no, we did not like the domestic debt restructuring, and we did not like that we had to shave in some instances and have to take haircuts. That was not what we wanted. That was not what anybody who had invested their own capital would have wanted. But in the interest of ensuring that we were equal to the task of national development, those were decisions that were made in 2018. Mr. President, not only did this government in 2018 demonstrate that we were navigating those fiscal crises and we had to make adjustments, I want to spend a moment to share with you what that adjustment looked like. I already have shared, Mr. President, that at the end of 2017, as we approached 2018, debt to GDP was around 176.8%. By the end of March 2020, at the start of the pandemic, and the Right Honourable Owen Arthur, in his writings in 2018, in his speech to Parliament, in his farewell to Parliament, could not have anticipated, unless he was Jesus Christ himself, he could not have anticipated, Mr. President, that what he saw in 2018 as the greatest challenge that this country had ever faced, a fiscal crisis, would have been compounded by the first pandemic since the Spanish flu in the 1930s. But that notwithstanding, Mr. President, this administration came to office and got to work. And so by the start of the pandemic, as it affected Barbados in 2020, we had taken our debt to GDP ratio to 117% by the end of March 2020. Mr. President, in the course of 10 years, our debt was at 176.8% of GDP as at the end of 2017. By 2020, in just 2 short years, this government and its economic team brought the debt down to 117% of GDP. Mr. President, as at the end of last year, despite the last 2+ years of a pandemic where revenues plummeted, expenditure soared. Revenue went in one direction and expenditure went in the opposite direction. This small economy still, despite that, never got back to 176.8% of GDP. We are still, Mr. President, at under 126% of GDP, despite the adjustments that had to be made, Mr. President, despite that. So I hear the pundits speaking about debt. I hear them talking about borrowing. And I want to take a moment, Mr. President, again, because I'm going to spend the time today making sure I explain this in context for Barbadians. Mr. President, in my presentation, in my preparations for today, I took the time to go through, like, as I said, some of these speeches, some of these presentations. In 2004, Mr. President, Owen Arthur, in his presentation to Parliament on the estimates, on the appropriation bill, he talked about how a small open economy like Barbados would navigate external shocks. He was talking about how Barbados has to be able to balance growth, and I will spend some time on growth in my presentation because I expect that to be an important part of the conversation. How a small economy like Barbados has to be able to balance domestic intervention in growth, private investment in the sectors to be able to stimulate growth on the private sector side, simultaneous with foreign borrowing. And he went on in his presentation, Mr. President, to say, Barbados has to ensure that over the preceding periods of expansion, this is up to 2004, that we had stored up enough buffer resources, especially in relation to our foreign exchange reserves, to absorb any reversal of our fortunes. He said, there was therefore at the time no need for us to rely only on the international financial institutions to mount a rescue mission on our behalf, as was the case in 1981 and then again in 1991. We all know what happened in 1991. There was an adjustment that took place then too. So the question of borrowing has to be situated within the context of domestic intervention in the market by growth and development interventions. It has to also be buttressed by investment in the economy, and it also has to be managed by strong fiscal policies that allow for macroeconomic frameworks to evolve with a certainty of confidence that national development is what we as a government and technical officials throughout the public service are up to, and that the task before us is no less or no greater than those who went before us, and we are equal to the task. He said, it is important that we always understand the causes of recent reversals if we are to chart the proper course forward. We are here today, Mr. President, to chart the course forward. We are here presenting what this administration not only has done, which is to restore confidence in the Barbados economy, notwithstanding what some who in their bubbles may think is not a demonstration of confidence, because I don't know, Mr. President, how Standard & Poor, Moody's, and all of those who have inspired the lack of confidence through their independent assessments and rankings up to 2018, up to B- and C, even ratings of our sovereign debt, up to now in 2023, notwithstanding the intervention of a pandemic, notwithstanding an external and a domestic debt restructuring, notwithstanding a hurricane, notwithstanding any of those external factors that were outside of our control, Mr. President, Barbados still has maintained a stable investment grading from every single international ratings agency that has assessed Barbados. So let us be clear that there is a narrative that is fake news, and there is a narrative that is independently verified by those who do not sit among the corridors of the Barbados Labour Party administrators. There are those who have been very clear that there is a statement of confidence in what has been done by this government. But I go further, Mr. President. We're not just talking about the ratings agencies. If that were so, some may still try to dismiss it. But it is more than the ratings agencies, Mr. President. The International Monetary Fund is not just an entity that comes in and gives us low-interest money. Prime Minister has spoken at great length on multiple occasions, Mr. President, about the cheapest money in town. And it is true, because all debt is not expensive debt. And when you are having bullet loans, and when you are having ballooning interest rates, depending on what happens at a given time, that is expensive money. There are people who in this country, Mr. President, for the purpose of being able to quickly borrow money, are facing extortionary, because that's really what we have to call it, extortionary interest rates, sometimes at 22.5%. 21.5%, Mr. President. So you may go and borrow a little $5,000 here. And if your $5,000 is not repaid now, 22.5% every single month is being levied on that principal. And that's compounded interest. So even if you try, you can't pay that off anywhere close to what you are navigating. That is the reality of what some interest rates may look like in this country. So in the interest of making sure that everybody understands the simplicity of what this is, I don't want to make it fancy in terms of international financial organizations. If you go and borrow $5,000 and you got to pay back 12, that's a problem, Mr. President. That's expensive money. You pay back more than twice what you borrowed in the first place. That's why you get the 68 cents of every dollar going towards debt. But when you borrow money at 2% maximum on average, or 1.5% on average, and you are spending it in public investment and public infrastructure, and then that, Mr. President, brings you down to 23 cents in every dollar, that is not bad debt. It is not unsustainable debt, Mr. President. That is not fake news. That is the reality, and that is the story of leadership, Mr. President. That is the story of the certainty of confidence that the Prime Minister has brought to this administration, the government has brought to this administration, and our technical officials, because they have to be credited, Mr. President, for staying the course, even though it has been difficult. They too have shown a certainty of confidence that they are no less up to the task than previous technical officials in all of our ministries than those that went before them, Mr. President. So let us be clear that this administration has still navigated national development, established the priorities, and I will go through what many of those priorities are and what the growth trajectory is, and then I will spend some time speaking about my own ministry and the areas for which I have direct responsibility and oversight, Mr. President. We also came to office in 2018, Mr. President, and found arrears. At the end of 2017, Mr. President, arrears stood at $1.9 billion at the end of 2017. 1.9 billion with a B, not with an N, with an M. By the start of the pandemic, Mr. President, the certainty of confidence that what we were doing was what was right and what was just and what was in the interest of national development brought those arrears down to under 100 million by the start of the pandemic. And those arrears continue to be on a downward trajectory, Mr. President. That is leadership. That is a certainty of confidence that we are up to the task, Mr. President. We had a historical low of foreign reserves. And if you recall, I just said, Mr. President, that the Right Honourable Owenasa talked about ensuring, he said, that we have to ensure that we have enough buffer resources, especially in relation to our foreign exchange reserves. We came to office in 2018 and the dollar was under threat because our foreign exchange were at a historical low. Owenasa said this in 2004, and I'll read it again. We have to ensure that Barbados has stored up enough buffer resources, especially in relation to our foreign exchange reserves, to absorb any reversals. Mr. President, international reserves took a historical low at $440 million in May of 2018 when we came to office. They now stand in excess of $3 billion. $3 billion, and they may even be higher, Mr. President, as a result of additional resources that have come in over the last month. Barbados is at a historical high, having come from a historical low. That is a certainty of confidence, Mr. President. That is a certainty of leadership that is up to the challenges of national development, notwithstanding what is being thrown at this little island. Mr. President, we have seen, Mr. President, that prior to the pandemic, in financial years 2018 and 2019, and then 2019 and 2020, that we had primary surpluses that then allowed Barbados, notwithstanding an external debt restructuring, notwithstanding a domestic debt restructuring, then put additional resources into beginning the process led by this government of nation building. And that, Mr. President, is where I want to anchor the remaining section of my comments this morning. We have, despite the intervention of COVID-19, a hurricane, and a volcano, we have still kept our debt on a clear downward trajectory, Mr. President. I want to be clear, a clear downward trajectory. Now, Mr. President, what are some of the key things that we have been able to accomplish? I mentioned the arrears just now. In less than 2 years, up until 2020 when the pandemic began, we had cleared 87% of the arrears that had been accumulated in the preceding 10 years. It took the Barbados Labour Party 2 years to clear 87% of the arrears that the Democratic Labour Party accumulated in 10. If that is not a certainty of confidence and a certainty in leadership, Mr. President, then I don't know what that is. We now remain today current on all government obligations. I did not say some. I did not say the majority. I said all government obligations. We have also been able to focus on social spending, and the Minister with responsibility for health sits in this honourable chamber, and I expect that he is going to speak at some time, and he will share on the issues under his direct responsibility. But what I can say, Mr. President, is that when I looked at the estimates of expenditure for the Ministry of Health prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, and now in this financial year, Mr. President, we saw a massive spike in expenditure under the Ministry of Health during the period of the pandemic, where a government committed to national development did not say to Barbadians, fend for yourself, rep for yourself. We are going to invest instead, which is what we said, in social spending and in health expenditure. What government that does not care does that, Mr. President? During those years, we could already talk about growth. We could plan growth. We could project for where we want to go. But you had a country that had the bottom taken out of its economy in 2020, where the revenue loss from government was in excess of $600 million. Government had the bottom of its economy taken out from its main foreign exchange earner. What is that sector? I spent 2.5 years sitting in that chair, the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport. In the first part of 2020, Mr. President, there were 2,000 arrivals in this country. 2,000 arrivals in this country, Mr. President. Do we know what that translates into? 2,000. This is a country, Mr. President, that on an annual basis sees an approximate 1.2 million people passing through this country. And for 6 months, we had 2,000. That is nothing to sniff at, Mr. President. Nothing to sniff at. So what do those 1.2 million people translate into, Mr. President? And I go back to the Right Honourable Uenafa in his commentary. He spoke in 2001, Mr. President, and I liked some of the things that he said there, in particular about the role that we must play in the importance of the tourism sector. I want to take a minute to share that with you. Because he was speaking this year, this was the 2004 year actually, my apologies, Mr. President. He was speaking at the time about the role that the tourism sector plays in stimulating domestic demand and the fight for, and the investment in the productive sectors overall. He said this, Mr. President. I'm going to find it, but while I do that, Mr. President, let me just take a minute to say something else that he mentioned that I'm going to come to in a moment, but I'll speak to it in the course of my own presentation on my ministry. He went on to say here, Mr. President, that in 2004, the hallmarks for managing a small economy that is dependent on the tourism sector will mean that the scope of adjustment is often small. The range of options are limited, but the potential for catastrophic failure is vast. He went on to say that they had seen an increase in the number of arrivals in the tourism sector, and that there had to be an investment in ensuring that, and this is a current conversation which continues today, Mr. President. He said, and I just lost where I had it after finding it at great effort. Anyway, I'll find it, Mr. President, but the point that he was making there, if I can't quote him directly, he said, the expansion of the domestic economy to account for the number of persons who are not based in Barbados allow for the investment in the productive sectors by manufacturing, increased consumption, by a population that in summary expands from 280,000 persons to over 1 million persons consuming goods and services. Now, what are those goods and services, Mr. President? It means that an export-oriented sector like the tourism sector then has to be in a position to deal with what? Here it goes. He went on to say, in the economic environment after September 11th, he was speaking in 2004, we search for and are coming close to applying the ideal mix of policies which balance the need for us to look at the productive sectors, including manufacturing and agriculture, while not imposing burdens that are excessive on tourism and international business activity. And so there is this mix of policy interventions that he was prescribing back in 2004 as the country navigated recovering from the 2001 terrorist attacks in New York City and Washington, D.C., and now here, Barbados navigating what has to be the response going forward, the mix of policies, the mix of sectors, the mix of interventions as we navigate post-2018, the fiscal crisis that he spoke about, and 2020, what he could not have foreseen and what we have lived through, a pandemic that has affected all of our productive sectors. So here is what we are navigating, Mr. President. We had a BERT program in 2018. That was a homegrown economic program that looked at macroeconomic policy, that established what the parameters were for the first IMF program. And the IMF, as I said before, is not just providing cheap money, but it is providing the oversight alongside with the BERT Oversight Committee, which is private sector-led, not by the government of Barbados. It is private sector-led along with the labor unions under the social partnership. They are providing under BERT 2 the oversight over what these macroeconomic policies and the mix of macroeconomic policies will look like for the government of Barbados. But what have they been able to do? We are now looking, Mr. President, to be able to ensure that the 60% of GDP debt anchor is projected to be reached by 2035, 2036. And the projections are that with the mix of policies that the government has introduced and been anchoring so far, Mr. President, that we are expecting to reach that as a result of primary surpluses backed by economic recovery and structural reforms. Over the course of the coming 2 days, we will speak more about what those structural reforms are. But what we have seen, Mr. President, in summary, are the following things. The 2018-2019 debt restructuring resulted in a large reduction in debt service, as I've already established, 68 cents in a dollar to 23 cents in a dollar. And because the government has made the decisions to either swap long-term debt or discounted debt and restructured securities that now have a longer grace period and maturity along with lower interest rates. That is what this government has been able to accomplish. It's not what we are proposing to do only going forward. You can see it whether you want to see it or not. It is there in paper and in assessments for all to see. We also now have, Mr. President, under some of our external debt, restructured external debt, where there is a 5-year grace period due only from 2025 onwards with a much smoother debt service profile than was originally anticipated before the restructuring. We also are seeing, Mr. President, the assessment saying that short-term debt continues to point to a low risk with a small annual decrease in the total share of debt, Mr. President. And so we are seeing, as a result of COVID, that there was in 2021 an elevated level. We expected that because, Mr. President, let us be honest and let us be fair. The government did not, and I started to say that earlier, the government did not stop spending on health care. The government would have spent on Harson's Point. The government spent on the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. The government spent on provision of COVID vaccines. The government provided free testing to Barbadians for over 2 years, Mr. President. The government then would have ensured that Barbadians were able to benefit from health care. All of the equipment that was needed, that was not donated in some instances by certain charities who came alongside government and recognized the importance of that support to the national effort in the interest of national public health at the time, Mr. President. Those are things that the government spent on. The government then decided that it was going to keep that foreign exchange earning sector afloat. And it spent resources, Mr. President, in ensuring that the tourism sector was anchored by the BEST program, and and allocated over $300 million to support the tourism sector. One, to provide direct support for the re-engagement of employees and workers. Two, to ensure that there was greening, and I will come to greening over the course of my comments, that there was support for digitalization, because those are things, Mr. President, that will bring us into the third decade of the 20th century, the third decade of the 20th century, Mr. President, and that there was also to be the connection between the productive sectors, namely agriculture and manufacturing. But the government didn't stop there. The government still invested in the transportation sector by ensuring that pandemic or pandemic not, that we were able to introduce electric buses to take our energy costs down, Mr. President. When we talk about state-owned enterprises, we talk about state-owned enterprises and state-owned enterprise reform, and I hear a lot of chatter about state-owned enterprise reform. When I spent the time going back through estimates, debates, and even budgetary presentations all the way back to 1991, I can see no evidence of specific details on reform processes being embedded in that context. That's not the place for that. That is broad macroeconomic policy, and the government will make determinations over time on what the specific standalone reforms will look like as part of a conversation. But it's a social partnership, Mr. President. And I happen to sit in that social partnership in my role as minister, and I'm 100% certain that my memory hasn't failed me. But there have been discussions in the context of that social partnership on the framework for how reforms in the SOEs will take place. That is my recollection. And some of the people who are in the newspaper, over the last day or so, I remember, maybe I could be mistaken, they were there in the meeting. They sit in the social partnership where I sit. So if I heard it in the social partnership, I didn't hear it in cabinet on its own. I didn't hear it in parliament, Mr. President, but I could be mistaken. Maybe memory does fail me, but I believe that some of the people speaking sit in the social partnership along with all of us where these discussions were held. So if they don't recall, Mr. President, maybe I don't either, and we may all be mistaken together. But I don't think we're mistaken together. At least I know I am not. So in the fullness of time, government in standalone initiatives will speak about all of the reforms that need to be undertaken, and I will speak today, Mr. President, about those that fall under my own remit. I am reminded, Mr. President, that in the midst of the pandemic, a government with plummeting revenues spent over $20 million on the Harsons Point facility. $20 million on the Harsons Point facility. You know, Mr. President, I feel like sometimes, and we've said this before in this place, sometimes the Barbados Labour Party, we are our own worst enemy. We sometimes do things, we rush in. We say, look, don't worry about that place being overgrown up in St. Lucie. Don't worry about that. It's overgrown, vagrants have overtaken it. The bush taller than some people, I believe the Honourable Attorney General and the Prime Minister may have gone up there themselves, taller than them, and the Honourable Attorney General is not a short man. And the grass tall up to all, abandoned for ages, Mr. President. And in 6 weeks, this Barbados Labour Party decide you could come and turn a whole dilapidated facility into a state-of-the-art COVID facility. Want to tell them on yourself? Want to make it look too easy, Mr. President? In 6 weeks? When they serious? Want to come and remove 87% of arrears in 2 years, and the Democratic Labour Party accumulated it in 10 and then touch it? Want to make it look too easy? We make it look too easy, Mr. President, so that way people could talk all kind of things now, because they don't realize the effort that goes into a certainty of confidence that we are up to the charge of what this country needs in this time, Mr. President. We ain't guessing, you know, Mr. President. Our record in the last almost 5 years speaks for itself. We ain't guessing. I don't remember us having any downgrades, despite the pandemic. despite a hurricane, despite a fiscal crisis in 2018, we had not one. I don't remember us, Mr. President, having anybody raising issues except they have a partisan slant about the confidence in the Barbados economy and in our fiscal affairs, Mr. President, unless they got partisan slant. I don't remember, Mr. President, anybody questioning that Barbados did not deserve to be recognized by the World Health Organization at the global level, the Pan-American Health Organization at the regional level for its leadership in navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. And that leadership came with expenditure, Mr. President. It didn't come with talk, cheap, idle talk, Mr. President. It came with action, a certainty of confidence and leadership. So, Mr. President, we are now here in 2023. We are now navigating what our next steps need to be, having saved the dollar, having restructured the debt, lowered our debt profile, invested in social spending, shored up our health services sector, recovered in the tourism sector, Mr. President. Everywhere you turn, you see tourists left, right, and center. You cannot get a reservation. You cannot get a hotel booking. We went from 2,000 visitors in this country in 2020 for 6 months to now, Mr. President, likely to exceed the projections. When I left the Ministry of Tourism in October 2022, we expected that we were going to be at recovery rate. We have now exceeded recovery, Mr. President. That is a certainty of confidence, Mr. President. We have put our hands to the plow and we have not removed it. Mr. President, we now are going into a conversation about where we go next. So we have, not for guessing, but it is written and articulated for all to see. We have that mix of macroeconomic policy that provides us with the buffer of foreign exchange reserves. I talked about that. We talked about navigating what our debt profile looks like. I talked about that. Now we're talking about where we're going next, Mr. President. So we're now talking about growth. We're now talking about growth because during the period of 2018 through 2020, we were talking about growth. We expected that between those 2 years, we would have restructured the economy, managed our fiscal affairs, dealt with the debt, and then we were on a growth trajectory. But then COVID said, look, me here. COVID said, hold that. We're no hold tight. And Barbados then had to keep its head above water. And we were in survival mode. But we were not just in survival mode, Mr. President. We were always planning with a certainty of confidence that this little nation would rise again. And I want to again go back. I'm anchoring my comments today that in the words of the Right Honourable Owenafa deliberately, because I don't want it to be a no conversation. Mr. President, in 2001, he said, the great poet Ovid many years ago reminded us that there is no excellence without difficulty. He said, since I last had the honor to address this honorable chamber, our nation has had to endure more than an ordinary measure of economic difficulty. This is where I want to land, Mr. President. He said this, it may, however, be said of the Barbadian personality that our greatest character is to be found not in never falling, but rising every time we fall, Mr. President. He went on to say, and so, although the times have been tough and the challenges testing, our little nation has weathered its difficulties well. That was in 2001. Mr. President, I stand here today in 2023 to say to you that although the times have been tough and the challenges testing, our little nation has weathered its difficulties well, Mr. President. In 2023, his words are as true as they were in 2001. That is the certainty of confidence, and that is a stock of which this Barbados Labour Party is built, Mr. President. That is a stock from which we come, Mr. President. And so now we're talking about growth. Now we're talking about where we can go next. What's the next anchor of the economy, Mr. President, having come out of survival? We have 4 tenets that I want to share with you in my macroeconomic framing of where we are as a country. 1, a growth strategy that incentivizes the private sector to invest in the green transition in energy, my head, which I will cover, tourism, transport and agriculture, boosts the competitiveness of existing sectors, diversifies the economy with the fostering of new niches, and improves the doing business environment, while modernizing, Mr. President, the public infrastructure to adapt to the new realities of a climate crisis. That's a real thing. Our Prime Minister has been walking the length of the breadth of the globe talking about what Barbados is navigating with this climate crisis. We've been talking about the net zero transition by 2030. We have the Deputy President of this Honourable Chamber who has anchored many of those discussions also globally and in the Forum of the United Nations on what the climate crisis means to small developing nations like Barbados. And Mr. President, I take great pride. Many years ago, up until 2018, my very last article in a newspaper before joining the Senate and ending my writing was about not a crisis of confidence in Barbados' fiscal affairs. It wasn't about a crisis of confidence in confidence about Barbados' debt profile. It wasn't about whether or not we had sustainable debt. Mr. President, my heart hurt me, my stomach burned me. I could not process, Mr. President, that Barbados' public image globally have been so defiled by a lack of leadership at home and abroad. That I remember a certain person saying to me that they were at a meeting, I believe they were in Nairobi, and a representative from Barbados stood up and spoke. And they talked so much gibberish, Mr. President, that if they had stuck to the script that the technical officials had provided for them, they would have been better off. That was prior to us. That was not anyone on this side, for sure. And they were so traumatized, Mr. President. I remember them saying to me, they got up and went into the bathroom and cried. They could not imagine that this was what their beloved Barbados had come to. That was my last article that I wrote on in 2018, Mr. President, before we came to office, the last published article. Barbados lost its leadership position. We were no longer punching above our weight, Mr. President. People kept meeting us all across the region. What happened to Barbados? People kept meeting us internationally. What happened to Barbados? What's going on with Barbados? But Mr. President, we now have a Prime Minister who is being called by the leaders of the free world in some of the most advanced economies of the world to speak on a range of issues, including and in particular on issues relating to the climate crisis. Barbados has demonstrated not just leadership, but such exemplary leadership on the global stage that she is sought after, and Barbados, by extension, by all and sundry agencies. I have traveled, Mr. President, earlier this year. I had the opportunity, the honor to represent Barbados at the International Renewable Energy Assembly in Abu Dhabi. And I traveled to Abu Dhabi, and I was in the role of Minister of Energy for all of 2 seconds. I had just taken up office in October, end of October at that, and by January, I was representing Barbados in Abu Dhabi. So it was intriguing to me, Mr. President, to find myself completely unknown in those circles as the most sought after person to sit on panels, to make presentations, to be present in meetings. I could not get my schedule settled for the life of me because from breakfast, through meeting days, through lunch, through dinner, everyone wanted to meet Barbados. They didn't want to meet Lisa. It didn't about me. It's not about any of us individually oftentimes, but our Prime Minister's name and her leadership and her advocacy on behalf of small island developing states, and in particular Barbados, has so opened doors for many of us, including those who speak against the government oftentimes. They find audiences with those who would not entertain them ordinarily on their own merit. But because of the advocacy of the Prime Minister, like her, hate her, she is well respected globally, and she has demonstrated a confidence of leadership that others see. And those who don't see it, don't want to see it. That is by choice. It's not because it's not a fact. So on climate crisis issues, Barbados has evolved as a world leader. We also have agreed, Mr. President, as a government to have a fiscal strategy that ensures that a fiscal position on government's finances are consistent with the debt anchor. I mentioned that before. 60% is a debt anchor expected to be achieved by 2035. And on that basis, therefore, we are proposing to streamline expenditure and to reform the public sector, in particular state-owned enterprises. There's also a debt management strategy, Mr. President, that actively focuses on the debt portfolio to minimize costs, and then ultimately ensuring, because this is an anchor of who we are as a Labour Party, ensuring social cohesion through investment in public education, health, social development, and poverty eradication. This includes, Mr. President, NIS reforms, institutions that are meant to strengthen the gains. Prime Minister has spoken about the Fiscal Council, the Growth Council, and then the Barbados Delivers Joint Task Force. So we are expecting, Mr. President, that Barbados is on a transformational trajectory over the course of the next 3 years, starting with this financial year. Over the course of this year, Mr. President, we expect that through multilateral support, either by grants or low-interest loans, that there will be $1 billion in multilateral financing for direct budgetary support, and that includes, Mr. President, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, that's approximately $366 million, the extended fund facility of the IMF, around $220 million, as well as resources from the Inter-American Development Bank, approximately $300 million, and $200 million from the World Bank. That does not include, Mr. President, private investment capital. We're also expecting that another Barbados $1 billion is expected as project-specific funding over the course of the BERT program, and that will include partners including the Inter-American Development Bank, CAF, which is the Latin American Development Bank, as well as the Central Bank of Barbados. And then ultimately, as we know, there are a number of projects which are being specifically financed by the Export-Import Bank of China, in particular, our roadworks. And then that includes as well our domestic mobilization of financing, which would then be covered under the BOSS plus bonds with a cap of Barbados $200 million, Mr. President. Those are the proposals that we are hoping to be able to see over the course of the next few years. But we have to be able to then focus on what the growth trajectory looks like specifically. And Mr. President, once upon a time in traditional theory, we had to grow more, produce more, earn more, purely from productive sectors alone. But Mr. President, investment is one of the anchors that must form a part of what Barbados does. If we were to go back, Mr. President, to each of the economic and social reports, if we were to go back to the human development reports from the UNDP and from all the UN agencies, Mr. President, there is a thread which you will find through all of them. It talks about private sector-led growth. Private sector-led growth. The government don't trade. The government doesn't make anything. The government does not earn anything except through taxes or through investment. And so there has to be a role for the private sector, and that is what some of the commentators that I am hearing are missing from their commentary, which lacks depth, Mr. President, but I understand that depth is not required. It really just requires a buzzword. And so we saw, Mr. President, that when the estimates were being presented, there were a couple of things that became buzzwords, and it helped to shape the conversation. So by the time the Prime Minister came with the budget, which we don't debate the budget, but by the time the Prime Minister came to the budget, you have people predicting, oh, they got more taxes. And then when that didn't happen, oh, they ain't got no more taxes, but they ain't cut none neither. So the narrative changed. And then when it shifted from, it didn't cut that, they can say, oh, but taxes can come later on in the year. When you don't have anything to say, sometimes it's better not to say anything at all, Mr. President. You can't keep moving the goalposts, use the OECD or the EU now. You can't keep setting the goalposts and then shifting it when it suits you all the time. You're making it up as you go along because you can't find anything to say, Mr. President. It's better to stay silent. And so, Mr. President, we have a proposal at this point, and I happen to have had the opportunity to sit with the other members of the productive sectors, with the Prime Minister and the banking community and the productive sectors as well. Those who want to talk about confidence, I believe they probably have not heard the announcements that the domestic market will again have the commercial banks investing. They would like to have the narrative that nobody ain't buying the boss bonds, that people are afraid of government paper. They want to be able to have that narrative. So they're ignoring the fact that the commercial banks, which took a hard hit in 2018 in the domestic debt restructuring, have now come back into the domestic market. They don't want to see that. You're not going to hear that. But their narrative has to be maintained. So they can say what they can say, all kinds of things. And if you are not discerning enough, you would actually believe it is true, Mr. President. I remember when I went through those 10 years, I remember one thing I disliked about the government at the time. They would look up at the sky, Mr. President, they would see it blue, and they would try to convince you it's pink. And if you tell them it ain't pink, you insist it's blue, they're gonna blame you. You are a traitor. You're not supporting national development. You were all kinds of things, but Mr. President, the sky was still blue. It's still blue today. And so today we now have them, taxes gotta come. They're reduced now. Taxes can come later. They're still making it up as they go along, Mr. President, and they're still trying to convince us that the sky is pink when we can see it is blue in front of us, when the facts are there to speak for themselves. So, Mr. President, here are some of the investment-oriented actions that we are proposing, and some of them will dovetail into my own presentation on my ministry. This government proposed in these estimates of expenditure to incentivize investment in climate-resilient infrastructure and in the green transition. This government intends to incentivize investment in low and middle-income housing, invest in enhanced training and education, especially in new niche sectors, a high-skilled, knowledge-based economy, including digitalization, artificial intelligence, and robotics. And I pause here for a minute to say, Mr. President, this morning, Senate is my fourth commitment for the morning, but I had a meeting this morning, my third meeting for the morning before Senate began at 11, was with an institution out of Scotland. I was in Scotland on mission earlier in the year, and I had the opportunity to meet with a range of partners in Scotland. And this morning, I had the opportunity, Mr. President, to meet, along with my ministry, the University of the West Indies, and our various officials in energy, with Robert Gordon University and others out of Aberdeen in Scotland, to discuss the development of knowledge-based economies and the skills required for a knowledge-based economy to position Barbados for the future. So, Mr. President, if you recall, there are a few lawyers that sit in this honorable chamber, and there are a few doctors that sit in this honorable chamber, and there are always sub-disciplines within broad overhead disciplines, Mr. President. And so you have an energy sector, Mr. President, that once upon a time was based on oil and gas. Now we are focusing on a net zero transition globally. Different countries have different targets. There are not nationally determined contributions that countries have set for themselves. And that requires a transitioning into a new knowledge-based economy specific to the energy sector, Mr. President. We are going to be working with partners, including Robert Gordon University out of Scotland, to model Barbados's energy trajectory over the next few years and the associated knowledge economy that it would require in order for Barbados to deliver on that, and what investment will go along with it. So, Mr. President, let me simplify that. Once upon a time, you used to have petroleum engineers. They used to focus on oil and gas. Now, there are so many new sub-disciplines that have evolved in the energy sector that Barbados now must position its education sector to produce those skills. It is my ambition, Mr. President, as the Minister with responsibility for energy, to not just pilot what that modeling needs to look like for Barbados and what new skills Barbados needs to produce, but to be able to work with the Honourable Minister of Education, along with the University of the West Indies, the Samuel Jackman Prescott Institute, and the Barbados Community College, and thereafter, through the secondary school system, to produce the skills that Barbados's future energy sector needs in order to be able to thrive. Jobs for people, opportunities for people, investment opportunities for the country, new business creations, new business opportunities that can be created, new entrepreneurs, Mr. President. We're not just talking about the manufacturing sector in this instance, because Barbados can and must become a hub, certainly under my leadership in the ministry, for research and development and innovation in the renewable energy sector. Barbados must become that hub, Mr. President, and I gave that commitment. But we need the skills to be able to do it, Mr. President. So we may start at 20% of what we need, and we intend to build to 50% of what we need until we are in excess of what we need, Mr. President. And then guess what? We begin the process of being that little nation that produces skills for the rest of the world, that then Barbados is being distinguished not just for its philosophy on the climate crisis, but for its innovation and production of skills to service a global climate crisis that is affecting countries just like ours every single day, Mr. President. We have to be able to anchor that, Mr. President, and I am committed that in my ministry we will do just that. We are also, as a government, proposing, Mr. President, to mobilize domestic savings for local investment for Barbadians, to establish Barbados as a logistics hub. We've spoken about that at great length. To improve productivity, and to adopt more open and flexible labor market policies. Now, I want to get into my actual ministry, Mr. President, and the energy sector specifically, and then I also want to go on to anchor that in the context of the broader economic framework that I had just outlined. We have seen, Mr. President, not just the challenges of 2018, we have not just seen the challenges of 2020 with the onset of the pandemic. We have not just seen the challenges of 2021 with a hurricane, Mr. President. We have not just seen the challenges of the volcano, Mr. President. We have not just seen the plummeting of our revenue and the soaring of our expenditure over the corresponding periods. We have not just seen those things, Mr. President. We've also seen a war in Ukraine. We've also seen the implications of a war in Ukraine that has not allowed Barbados to escape. We have seen, Mr. President, the war in Ukraine resulting in soaring energy prices. We have seen the war in Ukraine, Mr. President, resulting in the impact on consumers of gasoline and diesel prices as a consequence, Mr. President, of what has happened in those economies. And so we have to ensure that not just are we able to, again, introduce counter mitigation strategies, but that we are also able, Mr. President, to ensure that Barbados is able to transition to cleaner forms of energy dependent on our renewable energy transition goals that then have the corresponding result of lowering costs to consumers. Now, what has been done so far by this administration? We have invested so far in the green transition in the following ways. The Fair Trading Commission, Mr. President, has published feed-in tariffs for independent power producers for a range of renewable energy technologies. We have also deliberately, intentionally favored smaller projects, and I want to spend some time on this. While we have favored smaller projects, up to 1 megawatt, up to 10 megawatts, a larger scale project, and over 10 megawatts, Mr. President, this is what has been critical to the philosophy of the Barbados Labour Party. We are not that administration. We're not that administration, Mr. President, that is making a determination that those who are the owners of capital and have immediate access to capital are able to come in once we announce policies relating to renewable energy and scoop up all of the available space that is on the grid to the exclusion of average Barbadians. That's not this administration's philosophy. It is for that reason, Mr. President, that last year you heard the Honourable Prime Minister announcing that there was a guaranteed right to renewable energy for Barbadians and Barbadian householders. What that meant was that we as a government are making a commitment that we understand that investment matters. The average Barbadian, me as an individual, can't necessarily, don't have the wherewithal. I even say necessarily. We do not have the wherewithal to invest in large-scale projects. Mr. President, this morning, it must be my last meeting before I came into the Senate, was a discussion with the energy team and the utility, Barbados Light and Power. And you've heard me say this in the well of Parliament when we were debating the estimates. Barbados's Integrated Resilience and Recovery Plan, the IRP, which was done in 2021, establishes that Barbados's energy needs will require us to have 280 megawatts of storage on the grid by 2030. 280 megawatts. At the end of last year, Mr. President, we have 5 megawatts of storage. So we need the gap between 5 and 280 is not even a gap. Is a chasm, deep. So the aggressiveness with which we have to navigate that space, Mr. President, is critical. So what that means, Mr. President, is that there must also be the occasion for large-scale investments. And why is that? 200 megawatts of battery storage, Mr. President, costs in excess of $800 million. That's not a small-scale procurement. That's not a small man. That's $800 million. What that means, Mr. President, is that there has to be space for all. There has to be space for large-scale investors that have the capacity to procure a part or the whole of what that looks like. And there has to be space, Mr. President, for smaller independent power producers who are also able to come onto the grid at smaller volumes at the same time. So residential clients, residential consumers alongside institutional investors. That is the Barbados Labour Party philosophy. So the major investments in the infrastructure will have to come from institutional investors, but also the projects that don't just take our individual costs down for energy or bring us into a net zero circumstance, but also, Mr. President, those kinds of larger opportunities that help to create jobs for people. Those are things which are important. So it's all right for us to sometimes speak in verified terms as though these are very abstract issues, but there must be an end to this tension between capital of different kinds and different classes, because it is an unfortunate conversation, Mr. President. All capital is necessary. There has to be balance. There has to be a large investment class. There has to be opportunities for small investors, opportunities for individuals. All must coexist, Mr. President, because all have merit and validity in the space. Mr. President, we have also been committed to closing a few of the regulatory gaps that remain in the feed-in tariff mechanisms, and you've seen quite a bit of that coming out of the FTC in terms of renewable energy storage technologies and licensing regimes. Over the last little while, Mr. President, you would have heard us speaking also about, we would have had the amendments to the ELPA, which would have passed through this honourable chamber some time ago, and we expect that in a short time, you will also be seeing coming to Parliament a completely new Electricity Supply Act, which will overtake all previous legislation, Mr. President, that then creates a modern regulatory framework for the entire electricity sector, Mr. President. But we are in we are committed as a government to ensuring that our local population, people, are enfranchised and can benefit from the alternative energy dividend. As part of this green transition, Mr. President, which is part of where the government also is navigating, and I want to take a moment to speak about some of the projects that have already been undertaken. Natural gas. We are working on treating the natural gas as a transition fuel. We have the National Petroleum Corporation that has already supplied natural gas pipelines in the eastern part of the country leading up to Sam Lords and the adjacent communities around the Sam Lords area. You are seeing the ongoing works around the My Lords Hill area. Brianna Drive has been completed, and at least 4 other areas are also there. The expectation is that that work will be completed by the Ministry of Transport and Works in the very near future, and we're looking forward to that being completed. Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, we had here in Barbados a delegation down from Washington, D.C., looking at the development of a 30-megawatt wind project. We are looking to see how Barbados can expand our energy mix, because each time we talk about renewable energy, Mr. President, we talk about solar PV. But the Barbados National Energy Plan, which was done in 2019, also incorporates a range of energy mixes well beyond solar PV, and it includes wind, both onshore and offshore. And Barbados is now in the process of looking at the feasibility of getting the data in on both onshore in the first instance, and we expect that over time, the technicians and the experts who have come down are in a position to be able to get the data and assess where we are going in terms of the opportunity. Originally, that project started out, Mr. President, as a 10-megawatt project. It has now been expanded to a 30-megawatt project, and there are others that we expect. We're also moving, Mr. President, to have the development of green and blue hydrogen. You have entities like Export Barbados, alongside with the Ministry of Energy as well, working on what that looks like. Now, I heard some commentary around Prime Minister's messaging on our offshore blocks, and I want to be clear on that. Prime Minister has been very clear. She was very clear in her statement, and I want to make sure that I am very clear in mine, because I don't think she was ambiguous in what she said. So again, a lot of this scaremongering becomes unnecessary. Barbados has 26 offshore blocks. We know this. They have always been there. Barbados has said, Prime Minister said, that we have an opportunity to be able to pursue exploration in those offshore blocks. But she also said, Mr. President, for those who have ears and want to hear, that she prefers philosophically, this is the leader who has been walking the life and the breath of the country, of the globe, talking about the climate crisis. That's who we're talking about, who made this announcement. This is the leader who has been talking about renewables. This is the leader who has been talking about natural gas as a bridging fuel and part of the transition. So this is also the leader who in the other place said, when we begin the process of offshore exploration, her preference is for natural gas exploration, and even if we can find someone, some entity who will pay Barbados to leave the oil in the ground, she would be willing to do that, because we have to be true to our philosophy. So I don't want us to buy into this notion about, oh, it is disappointing that we're going to offshore exploration. Prime Minister was very clear, Mr. President. She didn't stutter. She wasn't unambiguous in what she said. She said natural gas is her preference, and that is what I understand my instruction to be as a minister with responsibility for energy. She said it publicly, and she said it directly to me, and I want to be able to put that to bed now. In addition to that, there are also studies. We have geologists among our technical team. They're not guessing, they're not making it up. I heard somebody say to me, I didn't hear it myself, but somebody mentioned to me that someone talked about how we don't want oil rigs off of Carlisle Bay because they don't want oil exploration happening off of Carlisle Bay. Mr. President, you know that. You may know. I'm sure you know, Mr. President, because you are a wise man. You are a wise man, Mr. President. Carla Bley, offshore block don't relate to Carla Bley at the road by the Hilton. Carla Bley is the name of an offshore block, Mr. President. We must be careful not to open our mouths if we don't know what we're talking about because we mislead the public, Mr. President. We have to use our platforms responsibly if you don't know ask somebody. Carla Bay relates to an offshore block. They got all kind of names. Offshore blocks. We got Carla Bay, Bimshire, Blackberry Sheep, all kind of names. So Blackberry Sheep relate to the Blackberry Sheep up in country in St. George all of a sudden, no? No, Mr. President, they're the names of offshore blocks. So no, we are not having drilling off of Carla Bay. Let me put that to bed too. I'm reminded of the name. The name, we got Sugarcane, Chapel House, Kensington. We're not drilling off of Kensington, Mr. President. Basheba, we ain't drilling off of Basheba, and we are not drilling off of Carlisle Bay. That is nonsense talk, Mr. President. Well, Tupman, one here Tupman. Next time the land ship come through and somebody say we drilling up in Tupman. What are we talking about, Mr. President? Let us be serious when we are talking about serious things. So yes, Mr. President, that is what our offshore exploration bids will look like. Not offshore Barbados, so you can see it from up in government headquarters. That's what we're talking about. So, Mr. President, in my own ministry, again, as I continue, we've been spending a considerable amount of time navigating one of the issues that has been a discussion point around these estimates and around our allocations for macroeconomic policy over the upcoming year, the reform of state-owned enterprises. And I want to be able to pair my comments on the reform of state-owned enterprises in my own ministry alongside with the discussion on the reform that we have earmarked as a government on the doing business indicators. Mr. President, I was in a different incarnation in 2019 up to 2018 to 2020, July, the chairman of the Bridgetown Port. In that context, Mr. President, I presided over the Technical Port Efficiency Subcommittee. And in the context of that Port Efficiency Subcommittee, we looked at trading across borders, specifically as part of the overall doing business indicators. Now, we all know that the World Bank is no longer doing what we traditionally would have seen as the doing business indicators, but we were able to still use the metrics because the data and the measurements are still important, even if not necessarily the rankings. And so we took the time then, Mr. President, in 2018, to begin the process of breaking down the trading across borders indicators by looking at all of the metrics, documentary compliance, cost of doing business, documents that needed to be submitted, how many times inbound, outbound, export, import, all of those metrics we measured, Mr. President. And then we spread it across all of the agencies that covered the Bridgetown Port and the clearance of goods. Now, why is that important to doing business, Mr. President? 90% of everything this country consumes is imported through the Bridgetown Port. Less than 10% of our imports, usually perishables, come by air. But 90% of our consumables come through the Bridgetown Port. So efficiency is a direct cost to consumers, Mr. President. We had a number of arrangements that historically have been in place, in some instances for 26 years, that resulted in a cost to the final consumer. And we systematically, from 2018 up until the time I left, and have continued to do so now under my successor as chairman, and a successor minister, who then is now the Honourable Minister of Tourism and International Transport, those things have continued, Mr. President. And why? I'll give you an example, and I think I said it in one of my previous speeches in this honourable chamber. If a ship, today we have one cruise ship in port. There are 3 cargo vessels that will come into port. Today's a good day for that 90% of our imports. Today is a good day for our 90% of imports. And why is that, Mr. President? On the days where, from a tourism perspective, We are excited by 5 vessels in port and all 5 berths being taken up by cruise vessels. Those 90% of imports by way of cargo shipments become more expensive. And why? Because, Mr. President, cargo vessels are not given precedence over cruise vessels. Because cruise, people need to get off, the ship has an itinerary, it has to get to another stop, and people are coming in, they're spending money, taxis are depending on it, craftspersons are depending on it, restaurants, water sports operators, the beach vendors, they're all depending on that as well because that's part of the livelihood. But that cruise vessel, that cargo vessel, has to remain offshore. And when it remains offshore, Mr. President, it comes into port only when there is an available berth where it can then have the cargo taken off. They discharge cargo, Mr. President, when the port is clear of cruise vessels. But there's a cost, Mr. President, to that ship, that cargo ship remaining offshore. And what is that cost, Mr. President? The manufacturing sector will talk to you about demurrage charges, Mr. President. Demurrage charges can be accumulated when a ship has to remain offshore every single day that that container that is on board that ship is not discharged. A charge is levied against the importer. It varies from cruise line to cruise line, from cargo line to cargo line. It can be, Mr. President, as small as 5,000 USD a day, in some instances to the smaller lines. But it can go as high up, Mr. President, as 10,000 USD a day. So let's keep that cargo ship offshore for, let's say, 3 days. That cargo vessel finally comes in, takes that cargo off, and each of the regulatory agencies, agriculture, health, customs, then have veterinary health in some instances, have to clear those goods in that container, 20-foot, 40-foot container. The port will give you 72 hours in principle. We want to be able to get it out of the port, but you get 5 days that you're there. Port charges will accumulate after a certain time and that cargo has not been cleared. You have duties and tariffs that are being paid, Mr. President, and then you come back to having those demurrage charges adding up. If that container stays in the port for more than 5 days in some instances, those demurrage charges can be in excess of 100,000 USD plus. Those are costs that influence the cost of living in country. It ain't just that the government got control over prices. The front page of the Barbados Advocate today, Mr. President, says domestic prices, food prices continue to rise as global around the globe. Not in Barbados, not a Barbados Labour Party thing. I heard a representative from the other side telling they want the government to find a permanent solution to food prices. I tell you already, if you don't got something to say, just don't say nothing at all. What is a permanent solution in a Barbadian context to globally rising food prices? Ask me that and show me it for 10 marks and show the working. Show working for 10 marks, Mr. President. How does that work? What does that look like? What does a permanent solution look like domestically to an international crisis? It doesn't even make sense logically. But what the government does, the government then starts to deal with port efficiency, as I have been outlining. We want to make sure that that cargo comes into the port as soon as that ship arrives. And so you heard the Honourable Minister for Tourism speak about it. It was, I believe, the last thing that I approved before the change came, which was a dedicated cargo berth for the Bridgetown port that allows cargo ships to come in real time. So Barbados will now have a brand new cargo berth that allows cargo ships to come in when they arrive without having to wait offshore for cruise ships to go out. That's one part of solving the problem on a permanent basis over which we do have control. So don't we hold the ships offshore anymore. Let me make sure the ships can come in when they come and that they can come in on a 24-hour basis. So yes, let's get that done. Then we have within our control as well, Mr. President, the ability to ensure that regulatory agencies do their approvals in a reasonable time frame. So we set a 72-hour time frame within which all regulatory approvals are to be done. And a few weeks ago, under my ministry as well, from a doing business perspective, we hosted the Inter-American Development Bank team down from Washington, D.C. to look at the overall apparatus of cost of living and how our efficiency measures specific to clearances were affecting cost of living and what needed to be done to drive those costs down. How do we ensure coherence, Mr. President, between the work of the Port Efficiency Subcommittee, the work that was done by the Customs Department in the implementation of Asikuda World? That, by the way, Mr. President, under the BERT program, is one of the structural reforms that this government has introduced, a new Customs Act, Mr. President. That's one of the structural reforms we have implemented. How does the implementation of a port community system, which is being done presently by the Caribbean Development Bank in collaboration with the Bridgetown Port, help to lead to efficiency? How does the electronic single window use digitalization to speed up clearances so we minimize the amount of time that cargo remains in port or in containers uncleared and unreleased to the final consignee? If we can have same-day clearances, Mr. President, then that is within our control to help to drive the cost of doing business down. Those are the things that this government is committed to doing and is doing as part of our structural reform agenda and our efficiency agenda overall. That's part of our doing business reform, Mr. President. I had the occasion in my own ministry where we had instances where some documentation that was submitted by one ministry was not being recognized by another ministry. And so we had to make sure that we are not one government from Mali and one government from China. We are one government. And so government agencies internally need to also be able to understand what delays mean for cost of living to consumers. And so we're working through that as well, Mr. President. Doing business is very much a part of what we are doing as a government. We also, in my ministry, Mr. President, as we navigate what we have to do in terms of doing business and the cost of living, and this is not just about energy. I remember, Mr. President, in 2019, we had a retreat with the port, which developed a new mission and a new vision and new priorities. Out of that, we brought in a facilitator who was phenomenal. Literally phenomenal. He didn't look at it with us purely from a port perspective. We looked at ports around the globe and rationalized through his eyes and through the facilitators that were working with us, what will it take for an investor to be attracted to the Bridgetown Port? It is out of that process, Mr. President, that a 2020 $1 billion investment of the master plan that the port was developed. Simply because we needed to be able to rationalize what the transformation needed to look like. Even in the midst of a pandemic, Mr. President, even in the midst of a downturn in the economy, even as we came out of navigating the challenges of 2018 and 2019 and coming up in 2020, we were still planning for growth. And in 2020, a port master plan, which mapped out $1 billion in investment, is being implemented all now post-pandemic, Mr. President. That was because we had a certainty of confidence, Mr. President. We had a certainty of confidence in ourselves and a certainty of confidence in our officials and a certainty of confidence in the trajectory that we were setting for our nation, Mr. President. That is the work that continues today. We continue, Mr. President, 20% of our energy costs go in the transportation sector. That is where the work being done in the Ministry of Transport continues, and I will leave some of the others to speak about that. We now in Barbados have the largest electric bus fleet in the region. We have 49 buses, Mr. President. That's 70% of the available bus fleet. 10 more have been ordered, and under the Smart Energy Fund, which falls under my ministry, we are currently in negotiations for an additional number to supplement what has already been ordered, what is already on the ground, which will then lead Barbados to be not just the country with the highest available density of electric car buses, but put Barbados in a position, Mr. President, where we are reducing the cost to the consumer and engaging in state-owned enterprise reform. Why does that then connect to state-owned enterprise reform, Mr. President? We feel as though sometimes 1 + 1 must equal 2 for certain people to understand what we are talking about. When you take the cost of energy out of the transport board, and they're no longer spending the kind of money that they have to spend from central government on diesel, and they're instead using electricity to power their buses, is that not state-owned reform, Mr. President? Is that not to be seen as part of state-owned enterprise reform? Is that not reducing the outlay of government expenditure from our estimates on an annual basis, $30 million in some instances, and higher every year going from central government to the Barbados Transport Board? That is what we must not be so linear in our analysis, Mr. President. All of that, and that's not something that now has to come. That's something that has started from before. That's state-owned enterprise reform, Mr. President. Under my remit, as I started to say, we have entities that are also engaged in reform. The Barbados National Oil Company and the National Petroleum Corporation, they fall under my supervision, Mr. President. There is an attempt at this time, Mr. President, to reform those two entities. In 2021, because government is a continuum, and we as a Barbados Labour Party function as a team, I had a predecessor. The Honourable Wilfred Abrams was the first Minister of Energy in 2018, succeeded by the Honourable Kerry Simmons, and now succeeded by me. It is a continuum, and in 2021, the Honourable Kerry Simmons was the minister at the time. And we have a reform plan developed by the Inter-American Development Bank for Barbados to go into cleaner energy spaces, new business lines, and new reform proposals for the Barbados National Oil Company and the National Petroleum Corporation. That is state-owned enterprise reform. It has not yet come even to my attention, Mr. President, on its own. We had a retreat where the consultants presented to the two boards and the management teams of the two institutions, and we looked at what needed to be done and what was being proposed, and the boards are now in the process of rationalizing it. What then, Mr. President, would be the role of us coming out into the public space with a half-baked proposal. But state-owned enterprise reform is underway. And those are two entities that are critical to the energy transition. They are critical, Mr. President, to driving the cost of energy down. So that is the work that is underway there. And as it relates to doing business, Mr. President, KIPO, I said, I believe, in November of last year, when I assumed the role of Minister of Energy and Business, if I received 10 calls in the first couple of days, 9 of them related to KIPO. Everybody had a challenge with the way in which KIPO was operating. Now, KIPO has 2 roles to play, and I want to go back to the Honourable Oinafa again. He said, Mr. President, he was speaking about the international business sector at the time. And he said he was speaking about the issues that Barbados as a country had faced at the time. He said, beginning in 1998, our economic policy outlook had to be recast to treat to a new and unexpected challenge. As you are aware, sir, during the previous 2 decades, the development of an international business and financial services industry had been vigorously pursued as the most exciting and rewarding post-independence prospect for our society. It certainly emerged as our second largest and fastest area of economic growth. The scope for its further rapid development was abruptly constrained by the threat of the OECD Harmful Tax Competition Initiative, and thereafter by a series of initiatives in the international arena to stem the outsourcing of economic activity from the developed to the developing world. This was what he said in 2004. Mr. President, in November last year, I received a call from the Director of International Business. He said to me, Minister, we have just wrapped up a meeting with the Forum on Harmful Tax Practices of the OECD. Barbados has received 2 soft recommendations and 1 hard recommendation. A soft recommendation encourages Barbados to make further changes. A hard recommendation will result in a negative outcome to the EU Code of Conduct group, and thereafter a possible Annex II listing, otherwise known as a blacklisting of Barbados. We sat in this honorable chamber and we did a couple of things around that particular time. Mr. President, we immediately reached out to the private sector, immediately reached out to the service providers. We reached out to the lawyers, the tax planners, the global business sector, the local financial services community, and we said, we have 2 options. Remember, Mr. President, this is a country that has had the bottom taken out of it from tourism. 2,000 people in 6 months in 2020. We now are in recovery mode. And as you feel you can catch your hand, whoop-ats, hold that. We could get a negative listing. So what did we do, Mr. President? We presented 2 options to the service providers. We said, look, we could either say, we don't care what you say, we don't think it's fair, you're taking the bottom out of our sector, we're a small, open, developing economy, you can't do that, but they could. Or alternately, we can take the necessary actions that they are urging us to take. And so we did. We did so with a certainty of confidence, Mr. President. We did so with a certainty of confidence that we were equal to the task. And I want to take the opportunity to commend the International Business Unit, the Barbados Revenue Authority, and all of the partners, the Barbados International Business Association, the Bar Association, for working with us through that Christmas period, notwithstanding the times that we wanted to spend with our families, to ensure that by February 15th, Mr. President, by February 15th, we were able to reverse what would have been a negative outcome with a hard recommendation to that single hard recommendation becoming a 3rd soft recommendation, giving Barbados the opportunity to avoid having the bottom further taken out of our global business sector. Why is that important, Mr. President? It means, Mr. President, that we as a country, our first revenue earner is tourism. We are investing in that. We've spoken about what many of those things will be. We've talked about doing business, Mr. President. We've talked about the macroeconomic framework. And international business is our 2nd largest revenue earner. And so we had to protect our sector. But what are we doing in that sector, Mr. President, to be able to ensure growth? Because growth is a part of the agenda. What are we doing, Mr. President? We have begun the process, Mr. President, of looking both at how we secure our defensive interests, these constant entreaties from the OECD harmful tax, as well as from the EU. Those will become our defensive interests, as well as our offensive interests. What countries should Barbados be looking to for further investment? In what sectors? What business clusters should Barbados be looking at? How do we ensure that Barbados' regulatory regime is the most attractive in the region? And that's where CAIPO reform comes in, Mr. President, because if it is that further in the year, there is a convergence of the tax rate as a result of the initiative by the OECD. It means that countries will have to make a determination on where they are willing to pay the minimum tax. Are they going to pay in their home country, or are they going to pay in an overseas jurisdiction? And if they make the determination that they're going to pay in an overseas jurisdiction, what would be the factors that would distinguish Barbados to helping them to make that decision? We as a ministry and as a country and as a government are being proactive about our offensive interests to ensure that Barbados is positioned as a domicile of choice for global business by ensuring that there is a complete reform of our regulatory regime, including but not limited to the work of CAIPO. That is our commitment, and the expectation is that over the course of the coming year, because these are not small things, this is heavy work, Mr. President, and I want to answer those who may come to speak on this. The first report that I have seen on CAIPO reform, Mr. President, dates back to 2011. The second report that I have seen, we were not the government then. The second report that I have seen, Mr. President, also on KIPO reform was in 2016, Mr. President. None of those reforms were ever implemented from 2011 through 2016 to the extent, Mr. President, that in 2022, when a summary report was made on how to reform KIPO, the consultants at the time said this: there are previous reports on the reform of this entity. We are not here to rehash those reports. This report has to be about implementation. But I go further, Mr. President. Yes, it is about implementation, but at the same time, Mr. President, what was determined in 2011 and 2016 may not necessarily be fit for purpose in 2023. And so we have to be able to use that as a baseline for positioning Barbados and KIPO and all of our regulatory agencies to be best in world class, not best in class relative to what was written in 2011 or 2016. It has to be best in world class. And to that extent, I have certainly asked my officials to give me an assessment of where Barbados is positioned in terms of the length of time it takes to do business in this country, in that organization, and to measure it against our competitors. If it takes 4 days in a competing country, Barbados has to do it in 3. 1. If it takes 1 day in a competing jurisdiction, Barbados has to do it in hours. If it is an instantaneous process in another jurisdiction, Barbados must also be instantaneous, because Barbados must always, again, in the words of Owen Nathan, you do not run a race to get the bronze. You run a race to get the gold. We are going for the gold in this country with a certainty of confidence that we are up to the task, Mr. President. And as I prepare to close my introduction of these estimates of expenditure on this appropriation bill, Mr. President, I want to round out my presentation with the following. We have a number of speakers who will follow me on the government side. They will speak to the various heads of expenditure and what government is proposing to do and what we have already done in the various sectors, Mr. President. We have a comprehensive set of reforms that are underway in the government, at central government, and in the state-owned enterprises that will be unfolded over time and further developed and further elaborated on. We have a mission economy that we are developing, Mr. President. We are not developing, someone said in a meeting I was in earlier this morning that, the Barbados Labour Party, and I said it earlier, we make it look too easy. We come with all these high-ended transformational goals where we see Barbados as it can be. We position Barbados as it can be in the world. But there are those who want us to move a little slower. There are those who want us to stay a little behind the pack. There are those who want us to hold straight. There are those who want us to be more conservative. There are those who don't want it to go at all. And someone described it to me in these terms, Mr. President. The Barbados Labour Party, over its history, has always led the process of transformation and complete transformation of the country. And each time the Democratic Labour Party comes into office, they reverse it and slow it down. They have never been the party of transformation, and therefore they cannot understand what transformation looks like when the Barbados Labour Party describes it. They have always benefited from work which has been started by this government, by this administration, by this party, and they have reversed each of the gains every single time, Mr. President. They take and make political footballs of a partisan nature, things that ought to be transformational in the interest of Barbadians, Mr. President. And this government, this administration, is about allowing Barbadians to dream, to be inspired, to aspire, to ensure that we are exultant and free, Mr. President, that we are able to compete with the best in class wherever they may come from in the world, and we are not constrained by the vision of that which we can see within 166 square miles. That is a transformational agenda that you will hear about from this government as you hear from the government side over the course of the coming days. You will hear about transformation in the agricultural sector. Mr. President, the Honourable Minister for Agriculture has spoken about what that looks like. You will hear, Mr. President, about what the Ministry of Health has done, and we've talked about that. We've lived through that, Mr. President. We benefited from that. You'll hear about how people who walk and live among us, people who are our neighbors, our sisters, our brothers, our friends, how they have benefited from the programs of this country. Has it always been perfect? Mr. President, unless you are Jesus Christ, you are never going to be perfect. There will always be humps and bumps, Mr. President. But what this government has always demonstrated a commitment to is listening to people. What we have always demonstrated a commitment to is engaging with people, hearing their concerns, listening to what benefits them, listening to how people want us to be able to govern, and pivoting to be able to ensure that we take people along with us. Can we do more? Yes. Will we do more? We will. Is there room for improvement? There must be. But I want to be absolutely clear as I close, Mr. President, that this government, and I'm closing as I started, in 2 years, did more for this country than the Democratic Labour Party did in the entire time that they were in government 10 years before us. This government, despite a pandemic, Mr. President, post-2020, has done more in 4.5 years than the Democratic Labour Party did in 10 years, Mr. President, that they were in government before us. This government cleaned up the mess left by the Democratic Labour Party, and we are not guessing at that, Mr. President. It was there for all to see, and I'm not talking about sewage in the streets, Mr. President. I am not talking about that. I am not talking about the arrears that they left behind. I'm not talking about 68 cents on a dollar, Mr. President. I am not talking about that. I am not talking, Mr. President, about the number of buses that were not in operation or how people couldn't get a bus. I ain't talking about that neither, Mr. President. I ain't talking about the number of people who could not get their arrears paid by government. I am not talking about that, Mr. President. We fixed all of that. How could a Democratic Labour Party administration be standing up talking about garbage in their own sentences, Mr. President? They should be shamed. Shame, Mr. President. And worse yet, shame to have come from within the bosom of this Barbados Labour Party and jump the aisle to speak on behalf of the Democratic Labour Party and talking about garbage. In truth, you should be shamed. Shame, Mr. President. Yes, I heard you aside the talking garbage. Shame, Mr. President. Shame. This government has done more on all of those points. When we came to government in 2018, Mr. President, we didn't know that the then Minister of International Business has signed agreements that forced us to be in here until midnight, one night in December, to change our international business regime. We fixed that too, Mr. President. The things that Beijing see, the things that we live, we fixed all of that, Mr. President. And now, having stayed the course, Mr. President, having faced the greatest challenges that this little nation could have imagined it would be facing, Mr. President, with a certainty of confidence at every single turn from 2018 through 2020 and now in 2023, we have now turned our attention to transformation, Mr. President. And so, this Parliament is making sure that we have presided with greatness over the challenges that have faced our country. They have been indeed the greatest ever. We have made sure that we have made the greatest adjustments with an emphasis on people. We have prioritized our people and taken our people with us. We have done so with a certainty of confidence that this generation of parliamentarians, those that sit in this place and in the other place, are no less equal to national development and the challenges of development than any other previous generation of parliamentarians, Mr. President. And with these words, I wish to commend these estimates of expenditure and this appropriation bill to this honourable chamber. Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this honourable chamber now suspend for lunch until 2:20 p.m.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 2:20 p.m. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. This sitting is suspended until 2:20 p.m. today.